In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to use the hypertexture lighting model to create some very hyper-realistic terrains. Alright, so in the last lesson, we had left off our volumetric materials with hypertextures, and I wanted to use this lesson to show you a practical application of how to use it. So let's go ahead and load or edit our advanced material here. And let's switch to volumetric material, and then we're going to go to our lighting and effects, and we're going to switch this over to hypertexture. Now let's go back to color and density, and let's change the function that we're going to use to create this volumetric material. So double click on your function and choose any one of these that you would like. You can choose any function, but I'm going to use the fractals here because it's going to be going on my terrain, and I want to use one that's already built for me. So I'm going to use this fast rock. Now with this already set up here, let's go to our hypertexture material that we want to use. And you could use a procedural material or just load in a material. Now I'm going to load a material, and I'm going to use this gray mountain rocks, and it's under the landscapes collection here. You can find it down toward the bottom right here, and we'll hit OK. Now you'll see that this material is applied. Now let's go to our lighting and effects, or I'm sorry, our color and density, and begin to control how we want this to look. So just by looking at this, it doesn't look like it's going to do a whole lot. Let's hit OK and do a quick render of this just to see what we get. Now already you can see that this terrain is very hyper-realistic. We've got a lot of detail going in here. We've got areas that we have a lot of speckling going on to where it looks like we have some sediment in there. We have rocks and that sort of thing, and we know that this is a standard material. If I double click on this, I can come up here to the top here and you'll see that this is checked as standard. And all of this detail that's in here really isn't on the terrain here. You can see that we have some detail, but we're pretty close in our viewport here, and we're still getting a high amount of detail, and this is because of that hypertexture. So let's go in and let's learn how to control this hypertexture. So we can adjust the overall density. So if we add a little bit more density to this, let's hit OK and render that, and you'll see that we're getting a little bit more control over how this looks. So with all this density, it's kind of dropping down some of that detail. Now what I want to do is use my distance field here to help me out with this. So I'm going to hit my distance field, and if I begin to lower this, we're going to see some changes in our material. Let's do a quick render of this, and you'll see now we're getting a little bit more of that sediment, and we're getting a little more detail on our rocks here. So we can begin to use that density along with our field depth to really create a hyper-realistic terrain. Now you may not be able to see the difference between the renders right here in the main camera view, so let's check our pictures here, and here is one that we had, the last one. We can switch that. You see how that detail has changed. And then this was our first one, and this had a lot of shadows in it because there was a lot of terrain that was just being generated from that hypertexture. Now we kind of evened it out by adjusting our overall density and then also our field depth there. Now we lowered that field depth to kind of smooth out some of that geometry that was being created. Now if I bump this way up here and I generate this, you'll see that it looks like we have floating rocks across the top, and then we get this very rocky terrain that's almost inhospitable. But the floating rocks are one thing that I would be a little concerned about. And what's actually happening here is because we are taking that field depth up, some of this terrain is being created above the actual material. So let's go back to our material editor, and let's go in. For some reason it's not previewing the roughness on here. I'm not exactly sure why that's happening, but we can see it on our terrain. So let's drop that field depth down, back down to about 30%. We'll hit OK on this, do another render. And we've gotten rid of some of those floating rocks, but we still have that roughness in there. And this is, again, a standard terrain. No matter how close we get to this, we're going to get a nice, neat, crisp detail in here. So let's zoom in a little bit further. Let's get really close to some of this terrain here. Let's re-render this. And all of this detail is being created at render time, so it's not slowing our computer down. We have only half a million polygons in here, and Vue is more than capable of handling this. And just by looking at this is just a preview render. It really looks great, just adding that detail in there. So it's a balance of using that overall density and that field depth. Okay, so that's a look at hypertextures and how we can create more realistic terrains. And in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at our final material, and that's called ecosystems. And we're going to use this hypertexture here, and we're going to learn how we can create ecosystems using materials. So I'll see you then.